likely to go into the logic stage. So any division of the stages, again, is something that you should be flexible with. In our experience, that switch into the more critical way of thinking tends to happen around 4th and 5th grade. And I think that if you pull the grammar stage learning, which with its heavy emphasis on rote learning and on repetition, much past 4th grade, you're really losing, you run the risk of losing the child's attention, losing their interest. They begin to get very impatient with repetition. They want to criticize. They want to think. As far as the rhetoric stage, then, in high school, given the fact that we work within the American educational system and we have to keep transcripts and colleges look at grades 9, 10, 11, and 12, it makes sense to me from a practical level to begin an advanced plan of study like our rhetoric stage study in 9th grade. It's useful. Also, I think 9th grade is about the earliest, really the earliest, that most kids are ready to tackle the classics. I know there are classical programs, I know Veritas does this, that begin reading some of the classics, some of the ancients, the Odyssey, and so on in 7th grade. Some kids can do that. My experience is that most of them can't. Most 7th graders, if you give them the Aeneid or the Odyssey in the original, the translated, not a paraphrased version, are going to be pretty backed off by that. I think it's better to leave it for a little bit later.
Okay, so walk us through just some simple descriptions. Tell me, what the grammar stage is, just to make it a little clearer.
Well, I don't know. Do people? Well, okay, I can do this.
Well, not everyone has read your book, and even if you have, it's kind of confusing. In other words, I understand that it's divided into 3 different parts, but it's still not clear in my mind, really what the grammar stage is and what the logic stage is and what the rhetoric stage is and why it's so important to focus on certain skills at that particular stage.
Well, the grammar stage has a couple of things about it that are important. One is that you don't require the child to think critically and analyze unless the child wants to do it. There are a lot of curricula that push critical thinking all the way back into those early years, into 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. And for many children, they are simply not ready to begin asking about their academic subjects. Why? Why is this the case? Why is this true? How do we know this? They are not ready to think deductively. So rather than using a curriculum which forces them to try to draw conclusions out, it is more developmentally appropriate to use a curriculum which tells them what they need to know, and gives them an appropriate amount of drill and practice. The biggest difference in the classical curriculum between grammar and logic stages is that in the grammar stage, it's great to teach children by rote. Rote learning is good. There is no drill and kill. Children like drill. They like repetition. It makes them feel secure. It gives them a sense of accomplishment. I mean, think about how many times they repeat things, read the same book, watch the same television show, sing the same song. They like this repetition. That is the appropriate method of teaching. However, if you take that method of teaching where you are still drilling, memorizing, rote repetition, and then you pull it on into 5th or 6th grade, that's when kids start to turn off. So the real difference between the grammar and the logic stage, and this to me is the really important transition, is in the logic stage, you begin to ask children to find out information for themselves. You don't simply tell them what they need to know. You give them the book. You make them pull it out themselves. You say to them, why do you think this is the case? What do you think will happen if we do this? That which is frustrating for them when they're younger is exhilarating for them when they're older because you're giving them some control over what they're learning.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand this completely then. When the children are younger, that's when we want to emphasize memorizing facts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then as they get older, so what age takes place for the grammar again, when we're giving them the presidents to memorize and the state capitals to memorize, and just general facts, and we're drilling them on that to make sure that they're solid in that. About what age range for that?
Usually around grades 1 through 4. The transition to the logic stage usually begins around 5th grade.
Okay. And then suddenly when we go into this logic phase then, about the 5th grade, that's when we're asking them kind of why questions, why things work?
Well, there's no suddenly about it. No kid makes a transition from one developmental stage to the next suddenly. You will find that they grow impatient with repetition. The logic stage begins at the point where the child says to you, Mom, you already told me that, I already know that, do we have to go over it again?
Uh-huh.
You see, they're beginning to be impatient with that repetition. You got to pay attention to that. However, when they say that, whenever it is, doesn't usually mean that they've got it down, because kids who say that typically then, go ahead and do it wrong anyway. It means that it's now time to give them a new method of learning. But it doesn't happen suddenly. It happens over a period of time. Some kids leap into the logic stage. Some you have to kind of drag kicking and screaming into the logic stage because it's really easier for them just to be fed facts. Depends on the child. Depends on their maturity level. Depends on whether they're a boy or girl. Depends on what their academic strengths are.
So during the logic phase, we encourage them to do what?
To find information for themselves. We don't give them books to read and then simple comprehension questions afterward, because that says to them, the important thing about what you're doing here is that you find certain bits of information and then spit them back out. Instead, we say to them, after they read a book, what did you think about the main character? What did the main character do? Why do you think the main character did that? What you're asking them to do is not simply to spit information back out, but to think about how what they're doing fits into other things that they're doing. They're reading a biography. You say to them, okay, who wrote that biography? Who was it about? How far apart did these people live in time? How do you think that author found out that information about that historical figure? Now let's think about that historical figure. Why did that historical figure do what they did? Why did Queen Elizabeth never marry? When they're in third grade, you say to them, Queen Elizabeth never got married. And they say, that's okay. Okay. She never got married. When they're in sixth grade, you say to them, why? Okay. Let's talk about this. Let's think about this. You begin to boot them out of that more passive, receptive state into a more active state.
Excellent. Okay, so the logic phase generally starts around fourth or fifth grade.
Mm-hmm.
And what grade level does it generally transition into the next phase?
Well, the transition usually begins, I think, around eighth grade. Again, you have a transition. The transition from logic to rhetoric is one in which students begin to develop the maturity to really form opinions and express them. In 5 through 8, it's not that they don't have opinions, but they still don't have the maturity not only to have an opinion, but to back it up with information. So you're going to see a transition as they go on into ninth grade where they are able to begin to put together the information that they've collected in logical order. That's a skill that they've learned during the logic stage. And to use that to support an opinion, to say, here's what I think about this historical figure, or here's what I think about this scientific theory, and here's why. Usually they begin to get the maturity to do this around the beginning of ninth grade.
Okay. And so then they move into the rhetoric stage.
Mm-hmm.
And the rhetoric stage is where the student, what is the emphasis there?
The emphasis is on self-expression. The emphasis is on forming an opinion and backing it up with evidence.
Okay. So like you said about when you're studying history, having them come up with opinion about it and then having to support their opinion.
Right.
Kind of like debate, I assume?
Yes, very much like debate. Well, debate is a rhetoric level skill. A high school student should rarely, in my opinion, be given the kind of assignment where they are simply summarizing and repeating information. Pretty much every composition, for example, that a high school student writes should have the purpose of proving a point and supporting that point with evidence.
So what's the benefit if you're raising a child and you've gone through these 3 different phases, you end up with a graduate who can do what out in the real world?
Who can collect information, who can analyze that information, and can have an opinion about it. This is a skill that every adult should have. That most adults don't have it is incredibly obvious if you listen to any call-in talk show about politics, for example. People have opinions, but they don't know how to gather reliable information about, political figures or about policies. They don't know how to gather the information. They don't know how to analyze it to see whether it's accurate, and thus they don't know how to support their opinions.
You end up with a homeschooler who has a very solid base of basic facts,
mm-hmm.
and who knows how to find out what they don't know, mm-hmm. and knows how to express themselves in speaking and in writing in a very powerful way.
Yes, that's right.
What a fabulous education.
I think so.
So how does this tie in? Let's talk a little bit about learning styles.
Mm-hmm.
Can you use the classical method and still tie in learning styles?
Sure you can. The emphasis on classical education is always going to be a little bit easier for kids who like to read and write. But any time that you're teaching a child, you can use information that you have about their learning styles to give them a better grasp on information. You know, the reading and the writing emphasis in classical education, again, is something